Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. Over many years, the leadership of the Canadian nonprofit sector has been criticized for its lack of diversity. As recently as 2019, the Senate of Canada published Catalyst for Change, a roadmap to a stronger charitable sector. Among its recommendations was a proposed change to amend the Income Tax Act to require charities to report on board diversity when they file their annual T3010. Senator Ratna Omidvar, a co-author of the report, has since proposed Bill S-279 to do just that. Joining me today to discuss the proposed bill is the Honourable Ratna Omidvar, Senator for Ontario. Senator Omidvar is an internationally recognized voice on migration, diversity, and inclusion. She came to Canada from Iran in 1981, and her own experiences of displacement, integration, and citizen engagement have been the foundation of her work. In April 2016, she was appointed to the Senate of Canada as an independent senator representing Ontario. Senator Omidvar is the chair of the Standing Senate Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology, and served as deputy chair of the Special Senate Committee on the Charitable Sector. Senator Omidvar is a director at the Century Initiative, a counselor on the World Refugee and Migration Council, a founding committee member of Lifeline Afghanistan, and chair emerita for the Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council. Welcome back to the podcast, Senator.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you for having me again. I always enjoy these conversations.
Oh, well, I certainly do too. Can you introduce our listeners to Bill S-279 and how it would work when put into action?
Bill S-279 is a fairly straightforward piece of legislation. It amends the Income Tax Act so that the CRA can include an added question that charities would be required to answer when they file their annual returns every year, their T3010s. This bill applies only to charities and not to not-for-profits. And with the inclusion of a new question on board demographic diversity, we will get the data at a national level, which can be further intersected and disaggregated to give us an evidentiary basis on trends, conclusions, etc. At this point, I think we largely have anecdotes and spot studies. I myself worked with Stats Canada to do a survey of the charitable sector, I believe in 2020 during COVID. But it was a voluntary crowdsourced survey. And when you have respondents to the survey who volunteer themselves, let me submit to the listeners that there's likely a bias that they're already doing the right thing. We want to capture all 85,000 charities. We can only do that in a systematic, annualized basis if we have a question in the T3010. So that is what the legislation proposes to do. It will ask a question. The CRA will develop the questions, not me, but I imagine the question would be something like, how many board members do you have? Please identify them as per the following employment equity definitions. So it is grounded. It sits on another piece of legislation, which is the Employment Equity Act. We understand that the Employment Equity Act is due to be reworded, revised, to capture the nuances that have developed in the progress around this conversation. So as you know, it includes women, it includes peoples with disability, Indigenous peoples, and racialized minorities. It does not disaggregate Black people who have a very unique experience in Canada, and it does not include lesbians, gays, transgendered, that whole identity pillar. So I believe that when the employment equity definitions are changed, they will have a knock-on effect on this questionnaire. I have based, in many ways, this legislation on legislation that already exists in Canada governing the corporate sector. The Canadian Business Corporations Act requires federally regulated businesses every year to disclose the demographic identity of their governance. We're only talking about governance here, by the way. We're not talking about senior leadership. The CBCA, this act that governs federally regulated businesses, asks respondents to do two things. One, to report on the demographic data of their governance, and two, to file a diversity plan. This bill, S279, does not do that. It simply asks charities to disclose their data. And of course, the data can only be disclosed through self-identification. So governors, let's say a board of directors of a certain organization, are not comfortable disclosing whatever identity that they may represent. That is up to them. The law also allows self-identification to prevail in all of this. So that, in a simple nutshell, is the bill. It will provide data, which will hold up a mirror to the sector, and I believe to Canadians, about who governs, who leads, who makes essential decisions, who, boards of governors. I think there's a bit of a kind of like, what do directors do? Well, they make really important decisions. They hire, they fire the top leadership. They set HR policies. They are the ambassadors. They create the vision. They decide which direction an organization will go. So, whereas the operations is always left up and should be left up to the hired staff, one cannot underline enough the role of governance in all of this, which is why I'm focusing on governance only.
And so, why do you think that Bill S 279, this bill that would measure diversity among board members, is so important to the sector? What do you hope it will accomplish overall?
It will provide a baseline of data. It will dispel the anecdotes. It will hold up a picture to the sector and to Canadians whether, in fact, the people with real power in this country over charities are in line with the demographic evolution of this country or not. I fully accept the fact that there are some charities, by nature of their mission, they will only have directors drawn from a certain pool, let's say religious charities or ethno-specific charities. I fully accept the fact that some charities in parts of the country which are not demographically diverse, as let's say our urban areas, will or may not be. I mean, I'm not making any assumptions here. But we're not looking for individual charity information. We're looking for a national picture. And individual charities or sectors, let's say sectors, which are the next thing, maybe cultural organizations, may realize that they are either ahead of the curve or behind the curve as compared to environmental charities. We may find that regions of the country are different in different ways. It will provide us with a nuanced picture that can be disaggregated with rationale and understanding of why certain trends are prevailing and why not others. It's as simple as that. I leave it up to the charities themselves to decide on their next steps. The sector has always been a fierce defender of reconciliation, of inclusion, of anti-racism. This is their opportunity to contribute to that conversation in a tangible, meaningful way.
And once we have the data, how is it used? Is it made public? Is it, perhaps you could explain who has access to this data and just what will be done with it. Will it be anonymized? Will it identify individual charities? Like, just exactly what happens to this data?
Okay. So first of all, I want to assure individual charities that that data will never be made public. It's a bit like filing your income tax return. Your income tax return is a matter between the CRA and you. It's never made public unless you choose to share it with your accountant, which I'm sure many do. So in this case, the data is only available to the CRA. The CRA is required then, the minister of the CRA is required to file an annual report in both houses of parliament about the results of the data. We have 1 million directors, roughly, and I'm just sort of guesstimating this, 1 million directors, roughly. We got data from X 100,000. Some people chose not to self-disclose. What we know from the declared data is that women are well represented on boards. I'm making this up, Mary. I'm sort of, I'm trying to foreshadow what the first report would look like. That the charities have a challenge in including Indigenous governors or people with disabilities. And if we are able to follow the progress of the employment equity data, we would be able to understand that whilst women are well represented on boards, perhaps they're women of a certain kind. And that's the kind of information we are looking for. Then, of course, on application to the CRA, sectors, associations can ask for permission to disaggregate the data as they currently do with StatsCan. And so the data could be disaggregated by region, by sector, which I think is the most important, because then you'd have a sense whether the health sector is ahead of the curve, or whether the environmental sector or the international development sector, which, let's not forget, they're a huge part of our charitable sector in this country, and so it would provide the kind of information that would help organizations, charities make their own decisions. Make their own decisions. And the decision, I hope the decisions aren't going to be, oh gosh, we're behind the curve. We need more women. Let's pick a woman. That's not the intention. That I hope they would take a look at their systems and processes. Do they have term limits? Do they have nominations committees? Do they, how far do they seek candidates? Do they rely on the board members themselves, which is a captive group? So, I think we all know that. I think it's important to spread the net, but I'm not looking for action solutions. I'm at this point really only looking for the data.
I spoke to someone who referred to the phrase, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. And I suppose that is the point, if I understand you correctly.
Perfectly. Well said by that individual. That should be the headline of my speech. What gets measured gets noted, gets done. And right now, we don't have any measurements. And I also like to call this bill, um, we've had employment equity for years in this country. And I believe the employment equity law has served us really well in terms of employment. It's time for governance equity. And let's start with governance equity in the charitable sector.
What is the latest update on the bill? We understand it's in second reading. What can we expect for the next steps?
It is scheduled to go to committee. Hopefully before we rise in June. It will go to the Senate Finance Committee, because that is the committee that deals with all income tax issues. And then it will come back to the Senate. may get amended. I actually am thinking of an amendment myself to improve the bill because I've heard conversations and I've taken note of the concerns. So I have an amendment that I'd like to propose. My colleagues in the Senate may like to propose an amendment. When it gets approved as amended or not, it comes back to the Senate for third reading. And then once we deal with it at third reading, which means we agree to pass it, it goes to the House of Commons. And then in the House of Commons, someone takes charge of it and takes it through second reading, committee, third reading, and then it becomes law. It is a long, tortuous, circuitous process. And I will likely not be around because I retire in November. And I am hoping that there is another senator who will champion it for me.
Well, I do want to talk about your upcoming retirement in a few minutes. I just wanted to return to a point that you mentioned that I thought was really, really important. In February, at the second reading of the bill, you commented that we are dealing with a governance community of roughly 1 million individuals who wield the power to make life altering decisions impacting Canadians. I just want to give you a moment to expand on this a bit and explain why it's so important that we have a better understanding of who these people are.
Well, we actually don't know who these people are, but we know what they do. We know what they do and why they are so important to the public good in this country. The charitable sector enjoys a huge amount of trust in Ottawa, in Ontario, in British Columbia. We turn to the charitable sector time and time again in moments of need and in everyday moments. Food banks, health organizations, children's charities, women's shelters, you name it. In addition, the charitable sector includes a host of private foundations whose tax protected dollars are granted to charities for the most part to continue to their good work. We need to get a better picture of who these critical decision makers are. And this data will throw up a mirror, it will reflect who holds the power in the charitable sector of this country. And power is I think power is always interpreted as being something evil and controlling. And I don't actually agree with that. Enlightened power is power that exercises its influence in a sensible, mindful manner to serve the public of the day. And we know that Canada has evolved so significantly. Just in the last 2 decades, it has changed beyond my imagination. As a country, we are being transformed by demographics, and demographics rule. It's a statement I think I borrow from someone. Demographics is king, I think someone has said. And our demographic destiny is going a certain way. And governance needs to keep up with that demographic destiny. But I believe that keeping up with the demographic destiny is a matter of choice for charities. I believe very firmly in the better angels of our nature that are so deeply embedded in the charitable sector. Uh, and the charitable sector talks a great deal about all of this. I'm asking them to take a bit of a walk on this very same question. Walk with us, fill out the data, let us get a picture for the nation, and then let's see where it goes.
And what kind of support are you getting in the sector for the bill? Have you had any pushback? Is it generally very positive? What have you found?
Uh, I've had a lot of conversations with stakeholders, and I will continue to have them. And this conversation is an example of that. And I invite your listeners to email me with questions, explanations, opposition, because I'm really open to listening to all of this. When I tabled, was it 3 or 4 years ago, the bill on direction and control, there was a huge degree of enthusiasm for the bill because it impacted the daily bread and butter, the daily operations of charities, who they work with, how they are controlled, how they are empowered, etc., etc. There was a wellspring of support. The support for this bill is, I would say, um, pretty strong in the sector organizations. But the sector itself is having a hard time figuring it out how doing this will improve their daily lives. You see what I mean? So it's a little bit more nuanced. I've also heard real concern from small charities that they already have such a hard time filling out the T3010, and this will augment their stress and hardship. And I accept that. That is a valid point. And I believe the government, along with large sector organizations, have to demystify the requirements, make it simple for them, develop a template approach, as they have done on many, many, many other requirements that are put to the charitable sector. So I take those seriously. I'd like to propose an amendment to the bill that right now, if you don't fill out the questions, you are liable to be, you could be on the path to deregistration. I think that may be a little harsh, and I will try and seek some protection in an amendment because some charities will take a little longer. In the beginning, I am pretty sure there'll be growing pains. But then, just as in employment equity, over time, the corporate sector really got on board and it became simpler and simpler and simpler until it was just sort of part of the construct of doing business. And I believe very much the same. There will be growing pains, but over time it will ease off.
And I understand from reading your speeches related to sponsoring this bill that it's really quite simple. It's not an extensive, overwhelming number of questions that are being asked. This is, quite a short piece of information that you're requesting. Is that maybe you could describe what it is that they might have to do?
Well, they may have to say we have 20 members on our board. They already have to do that, by the way, in the T3010. There would be a subset is, do your directors identify with the following employment equity groups: gender, racial minorities, indigenous, peoples with disability. And that would be it. It would require the CEO of the organization or the treasurer of the organization or the volunteer who fills out this form or the lawyer to have backup and say, we have received these responses from our 10 or 12 directors, and we're basing it on that.
Sounds pretty straightforward. um, I want to move on now to congratulate you on your upcoming retirement. You were appointed to the Senate in 2016, as I mentioned off the top, and very quickly became a strong voice for the nonprofit sector. What do you look back on as a highlight of your work with the sector during your time as senator, other than this bill? What are some of the biggest moments for you?
I think there's, first of all, when I became a senator, I had no aspiration. It was not in my idea of how things would roll out that I would engage so deeply with the charitable sector. Uh, and of course I would, because my entire work experience has been in the charitable sector. I filled out those forms. I've recruited directors. I've raised money. So it sort of surprised me that I hadn't thought of it before. And then, of course, came the wonderful opportunity to engage, not just mile deep, but sector wide, square meters deep on the charitable sector with the Senate Charities Report. I worked very hard on it for 2 years as vice chair. We heard all kinds of proposals and read all kinds of submissions on how the charitable sector is not just essential to the health of our country, but it is essential to renew it through 44 or 42 proposals that we made. I have been able to act on only 2 of them. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done by the sector itself and by legislators and parliamentarians who want to support the sector. There's a recipe for success right there. It's not easy, trust me. I mean, it took me, I think, 4 years to get through the direction control, which was actually a very complicated, it's far more complicated than this bill because people don't actually understand what it is. Um, and of course, now it's beyond the guidance. The guidance has been issued. Charities will be hopefully embracing this path. The route to legislation is never perfect. So I'm expecting lots of hurdles and storms and cyclones that I have to face in making this bill a reality.
Well, you certainly learned on the job, I guess, particularly given that you weren't never actually saw yourself as a senator, so it was kind of a new development in your life and in your career. Have you seen the sector change during this time? What do you think will be the key issues coming up over the next few years?
Gosh, the sector has changed so rapidly, whether it's wanted to be changed or the forces around it have changed it. I think in the future or in the immediate, we have to deal with artificial intelligence. The sector has to deal with artificial intelligence and consider self regulations or guardrails that protect it or empower it, as the case may be. But I would encourage the sector to do it themselves. I mean, legislation by the government should be, I think, the last resort. Self-regulation, self-monitoring is always the better route. Um, I would say that technology related to AI and technology on its own continues to be an enabler for the sector. And my question is, has the sector enabled it enough? Enough? Have we had that kind of culture shift and culture change in the sector that says our workforce is growing, but it's not the same workforce as yesterday. We have a huge in the sector. We have a huge succession problem. You know, people are leaving. You know, the leadership of the sector is a certain age demographic, and the new young people that we need to embrace the sector with a passion are not attracted by the wages that the sector pays. So there's an inherent disconnect between demand and supply or supply and demand. And there's, of course, the age-old problem of money. How to raise money, how to keep money, how to spend money, how to account for money. I know the government has made some, in my view, enlightened moves in increasing the disbursement quota, which I think has benefited the sector. But we also know from data that charitable investments tend to go to a certain kind of charitable organization as opposed to another kind of charitable organization. So the sector itself needs to think differently about charitable funding and the instruments that it uses to fund itself. One of the recommendations in the Senate Charities report was on the measures in the Income Tax Act that relate to related business. Because more and more charities find that the only way to survive is to engage, possibly in related, indirectly related, or unrelated business. someone else will need to look at that. I think that would be a huge hill to climb for the sector because businesses would object, perhaps legitimately so. But these are all challenges for the future. But the sector enjoys the trust of Canadians. I think that is its biggest uh, 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 quality that it needs to amplify and to turn. It has to translate that turn into respect. And by respect, I mean new arrangements with governments, new legislation, a home in government, which I'm squarely behind. I think respect by government would translate into a home in government. So lots of challenges, but also lots of opportunities.
You've been so influential over the years you've been in the Senate. Can those working in the nonprofit sector continue to expect to see support from the Senate in your absence? Are there any other Senate activities moving forward relating to the sector that they should be aware of and potentially advocating for? You've mentioned some of them. What do you think is on the closest horizons?
Well, I'm chair of the Senate Social Affairs Committee. Every piece of legislation that comes before us touches on the sector. And every time, whether it's the disability benefit or a measure in the budget relating to, let's say, immigration consultants, it is the charitable sector that provides us with testimony that is based on lived experience and nuanced enough for us. So, I think the sector is already terrifically engaged with legislation, but the engagement with legislation is file by file by file by file. We need a vertical, horizontal, unifying mechanism that brings the voice of the sector to the government in a sustained, systematic way, and that is a home in government.
We want to thank you so much for your service as a senator and especially for your commitment to the nonprofit sector. As you prepare to step back, I'd love to ask you to look ahead at where the sector's going and ask you, are you optimistic about the future of the nonprofit sector?
I am an optimist by nature. So I am optimistic about the future of this country and about the role of the charitable and not for profit sector in this future. The future is going to be so different from our present day concerns. And I would want the sector to embrace the future with all its risks and challenges vigorously and have governors and directors who understand risk management, risk aversion in an appropriate manner so that we don't shy away from risk, but that we embrace it.
Well, once again, Senator Omidvar, I'd like to thank you for your service to our country and Ontario and the exemplary work you've done for the nonprofit sector, especially as it relates to equity, diversity, and inclusion across Canada. It's truly been fascinating and an honor to discuss these important issues with you and help bring greater awareness within the nonprofit sector to support nonprofits and charities on their EDI journeys. Thank you for joining us on Charity Village Connects.
Thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for having me.